On Sunday, August 14th, 2005, at precisely 12 minutes past noon, air traffic controllers in Athens watched a Boeing 737 fly past its destination. 2 kilometers from the town of Grammatikos, Greece, this modern airliner carrying 121 people continued on its flight path. It was unresponsive and climbing, not descending. A ghost plane with 121 souls on board, silently traversing the clear blue sky. How could a fully functional aircraft become an empty shell, ignoring all calls? The truth is, the problem began not in the air, but with a single, crucial oversight on the ground, a silent killer that would slowly incapacitate everyone on board. I'm Captain James Harlow. After 28 years in the cockpit of commercial airliners, I've sat in that exact seat, flown those routes. Look, what every captain knows about aviation is this. The greatest dangers often aren't loud bangs or sudden emergencies. They are quiet, insidious problems, procedural missteps that can turn an airplane into a death trap before anyone even notices. This case, Helios Airways Flight 522, is a stark lesson in how a single, overlooked detail can lead to the complete incapacitation of an entire crew. This was Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737-31S, registration 5B-DBY. It was a reliable aircraft, manufactured in 1997, with 17,900 hours of flight time and 16,085 flights under its wings. On board that Sunday, August 14, 2005, were 121 people departing Larnaca Airport in Cyprus, bound for Athens, Eleftherios Venizelos International Airport in Greece. Let me tell you who these people were. In the cockpit was Captain George Miller, a seasoned pilot in his late 50s with extensive experience, known for his calm demeanor. His first officer, John Stevens, was in his early 30s, bright and diligent, eager to build his career. In the cabin, among the many families and individuals, was Maria Dimitriou, a mother traveling with her 2 young children, Andreas and Eleni, excited to visit their grandparents in Athens for a summer holiday. They were just one family among many, looking forward to a normal flight, a normal day. Here's the thing about a modern airliner's pressurization system. It's designed to keep the cabin air pressure comfortable and safe, similar to being at around 8,000 feet, even when the aircraft is cruising much higher, say at 34,000 feet. It typically operates in 3 modes: auto, standby, and manual. In auto, the system handles everything. In standby, it acts as a backup, automatically maintaining a differential pressure. But in manual, the crew has to control everything themselves, adjusting the outflow valve by hand to regulate the cabin pressure. It's almost never used in normal operations. You have to understand, the day before this flight, the aircraft had undergone a scheduled cabin pressurization leak check. This procedure involved setting the pressurization mode selector to manual. However, after the check was complete, for reasons the investigation would later pinpoint, the switch was not reset to auto, it was left in manual. And that's where it all went wrong. Every captain knows the importance of post-maintenance checks, the final verification that everything is set for flight. But this small, critical detail was overlooked. The system was essentially turned off, but nobody in the cockpit knew it. Warning light and alert indicated, specifically highlighting the pressurization mode selector in manual. As the Boeing 737-31S prepared for takeoff from Larnaca, the takeoff configuration warning blared in the cockpit. This specific warning indicates that the aircraft is not properly configured for departure. It could be a flap setting, a trim issue, or, in this case, a problem with the pressurization. The crew acknowledged it, thinking it was a nuisance, a false alarm perhaps related to the landing gear. And then silence. The warning stopped. Once airborne, at an altitude of about 1,600 feet, a new warning sounded. The master caution light, accompanied by an amber light indicating an issue with the equipment cooling system. This light signifies a problem with the fans that cool the avionics, the electronic brains of the aircraft. For the flight crew, this was another puzzle. They consulted their Quick Reference Handbook, or QRH, a checklist designed for in-flight issues. The QRH entry for equipment cooling advised checking circuit breakers and switches. Crucially, the QRH also contained an entry for a cabin altitude warning, which would indicate a problem with the aircraft's internal pressure. This specific warning, however, had not yet illuminated. The Boeing 737 has a common warning alert for both the takeoff configuration warning and the cabin altitude warning. They sound exactly the same. So, when the takeoff configuration alert blared on the runway, the pilots might have been conditioned to think it was a false alarm, or perhaps a minor electrical issue with the gear. And then, after takeoff, they faced the master caution for equipment cooling. They were dealing with what they thought were two separate, relatively minor electrical problems, not an impending depressurization. They were trying to solve the puzzle of the equipment cooling warning when the true danger, the uncontrolled loss of cabin pressure, was already at work. As the aircraft climbed past 10,000 feet, the cabin pressure continued to drop, mirroring the increasing altitude outside. The air inside became thinner and thinner. At around 12,000 feet, the oxygen masks automatically deployed in the passenger cabin. For the 121 people on board, including Maria and her two children, Andreas and Eleni, who were excited to visit their grandparents, this was sudden and alarming. They wouldn't have understood the technical reasons, only that something was very wrong. In the cockpit, the pilots would have also seen their oxygen masks drop, and the cabin altitude warning light would have illuminated, finally clarifying the true nature of the emergency. But by this point, with their attention split between multiple warnings and the decreasing oxygen, their ability to think clearly was already compromised. Look, oxygen deprivation or hypoxia is insidious. It doesn't hit you like a punch. It creeps in, making you confused, lightheaded, and impairing your judgment long before you even realize you're in trouble. The pilots would have donned their oxygen masks, but precious time was lost in the initial confusion. They attempted to contact Larnaca air traffic control, reporting a problem with the equipment cooling, and then, with increasing urgency, a cabin altitude warning. Their voices were strained, their responses becoming slower. Helios 522, master caution, equipment cooling, cabin altitude warning. Larnaca air traffic control, in turn, tried to assist, asking about the status of the pressurization system. The first officer responded that the cabin air conditioning switch was in manual. This was a critical piece of information, but it was misinterpreted. He meant the pressurization mode selector, which was indeed in manual. However, the controller, hearing air conditioning switch, didn't grasp the gravity of the situation. It was a communication breakdown under extreme stress. Shortly after this exchange, around 10 o'clock and 20 minutes in the morning, all communication from Flight 522 ceased. The transponder, which sends identifying information and altitude data to air traffic control, also stopped transmitting correctly. The aircraft continued to climb, now unresponsive. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, or 10,400 meters, but the cabin never pressurized. Inside, with the oxygen masks deployed, the supplementary oxygen supply for passengers only lasts for about 12 to 15 minutes. After that, without conscious action to obtain a portable oxygen bottle, the occupants would slowly, mercifully, lose consciousness. In the cockpit, the pilot's oxygen supply was longer, but the effects of hypoxia were already taking their toll. You have to understand, even with supplemental oxygen, prolonged exposure to reduced pressure can impair cognitive function. The aircraft's autopilot, programmed to fly to Athens, continued its journey, then entered a holding pattern over the Kea VOR, a navigational beacon near Athens, as it was designed to do if it arrived early at its destination or faced delays. The Boeing 737 was now flying a pre-programmed path, a silent, unguided machine carrying 121 unconscious souls. Here's the thing. After about 30 minutes of silence from Flight 522, Greek air traffic control became gravely concerned. They attempted to contact the aircraft repeatedly on various frequencies, but received no reply. When there was no response, the Hellenic Air Force scrambled two F-16 fighter jets from Nia and Helios Air Base to intercept and investigate. This was around 10 o'clock and 55 minutes in the morning. This is a critical moment in aviation, when a military response becomes necessary for an unresponsive civilian aircraft. The F-16 pilots approached the silent Boeing. What they saw was disturbing. They observed the captain slumped over the controls, unconscious. The first officer was also slumped in his seat. The fighter pilots could clearly see passenger oxygen masks dangling throughout the cabin, a stark visual confirmation of the depressurization. Nobody saw this coming, that a modern airliner could be flying with its entire crew incapacitated. The most critical detail they reported, however, was that the landing gear was down. The gear was down, deployed into the airflow, even though the aircraft was flying at 34,000 feet, its cruising altitude. This observation, initially confusing to the F-16 pilots and investigators alike, would later be a key piece of the puzzle. It suggested a desperate attempt by someone to perhaps descend rapidly, or that an electrical anomaly was affecting multiple systems, triggering the gear. But hundreds of witnesses on the ground in Greece swore they saw something different. For hours, as the F-16s shadowed the silent airliner, reports came in of a lone figure moving in the cockpit. This contradicted the fighter pilot's initial assessment, which had reported both pilots as incapacitated. It created confusion among those watching the unfolding tragedy from below. How could anyone possibly be conscious and moving on an aircraft that had been flying for hours, with no cabin pressure? This critical detail, initially considered by some to be misidentification or a result of the immense stress of the situation, turned out to be profoundly important. It pointed to an extraordinary act of heroism. At approximately 11 o'clock and 49 minutes, the F-16 pilots confirmed seeing that lone figure in the cockpit. This was Andreas Prodromou, a 32-year-old flight attendant on board Flight 522. Prodromou had previously served as a paratrooper in the Cypriot Special Forces and held a commercial pilot's license, though he was not type-rated for the Boeing 737. Being type-rated means a pilot has undergone specific training and certification to operate a particular aircraft model. Despite this, he possessed a foundational understanding of aviation principles. He had somehow managed to remain conscious, likely by using a portable oxygen bottle, an emergency device designed for just such situations, or by accessing the cockpit's extended oxygen supply system. He made his way to the flight deck, a journey through a cabin filled with 121 unconscious passengers. It was an act of remarkable resilience and training under the most severe circumstances. Prodromou attempted to take control of the aircraft. The F-16 pilots observed him in the captain's seat, trying to manipulate the controls. He was seen attempting to send a mayday call, an international distress signal used in aviation, but his radio transmissions were garbled. This was partially because he was likely using the wrong frequency, unable to establish clear communication with air traffic control, and partially due to his own compromised state. Even with supplemental oxygen, the effects of prolonged hypoxia, or oxygen deprivation, would have taken a significant toll on his coordination and decision-making abilities. He was trying to bring the plane down, to save everyone on board. Here's the thing. Prodromou was fighting against an autopilot system that was still trying to maintain its programmed flight path. The Boeing 737 was designed to fly to Athens, and when it arrived early at its destination, or faced delays, its programming directed it to enter a holding pattern over the Kia VOR, a navigational beacon near Athens. This is a standard procedure. For Prodromou to take full control, he needed to disengage the autopilot. This requires specific actions and knowledge of the aircraft's systems, especially under the duress of hypoxia, and with limited experience in a Boeing 737 cockpit. He then needed to initiate a controlled descent and somehow land this unresponsive airliner. The task was monumental, almost impossible given the circumstances. He was alone, without the assistance of a trained co-pilot or air traffic control, facing a complex aircraft he was not certified to fly. Mayday! Mayday! By 12 o'clock, the aircraft was critically low on fuel. The Boeing 737-31S had been flying for over 3 hours since takeoff, far longer than its intended journey to Athens. It had consumed its fuel reserves while circling in the holding pattern. The CFMIC FM56-3C1 engines, starved of jet fuel, began to flame out. The left engine failed first, followed by the right engine just minutes later. The Boeing 737 was now in an unpowered flight condition, descending without thrust. Prodromou was still in the cockpit, still trying, his last desperate efforts observed by the helpless F-16 pilots. The aircraft, now weighing over 100,000 pounds, began its uncontrolled descent. The F-16 pilots watched as Flight 522 pitched nose down, falling rapidly towards the ground. The final, conscious efforts of Andreas Prodromou, the flight attendant, were not enough to overcome the impossible situation. The airframe groaned under the strain. The last, desperate attempts to control the Boeing 737 were futile. Prodromou was still in the captain's seat, fighting the unresponsive controls, his vision blurring, his body weakened by the prolonged oxygen starvation. The world outside the cockpit windows was a dizzying blur of green and brown. The ground was no longer distant, it rushed up, an unstoppable force. The aircraft, now a heavy, unpowered mass of metal and 121 souls, plummeted. At precisely 12 o'clock and 3 minutes, on Sunday, August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 impacted a hillside 2 kilometers from Grammatikos, Greece. The impact was absolute. There were no survivors. All 121 people on board perished. The airframe shudders violently. Prodromou, weakened, still grips the control column, a dead weight in his hands. His vision blurs. The world outside the cockpit windows, a dizzying rush of green and brown. The ground is no longer distant. It fills the entire windscreen, immediate and unforgiving. The aircraft, now a heavy, unpowered mass of metal descending at an estimated rate exceeding 10,000 feet per minute, is not flying. It is falling. The wind screams around the fuselage, a raw, tearing sound. Inside the cabin, the 121 souls, long since unconscious, are subjected to immense forces. Their limp bodies are pushed against their seatbelts, then slammed back as the aircraft pitches and bucks in its final uncontrolled plunge. Metal strains, rivets groan. Then, with an absolute crushing force, everything stops. There is no sound, no movement, just silence. Andreas Prodromou's fight in those final minutes was an act of extraordinary courage, battling an aircraft not his own, against the crushing effects of oxygen starvation and the complexities of an autopilot that still held its grip. But he was severely impaired. Without full awareness of the aircraft's systems, without the strength and mental clarity that only sustained oxygen could provide, his fight was ultimately against physics and an unforgiving timeline. There simply was not enough time, or enough clarity, to overcome the cumulative failures that had already sealed the fate of Flight 522. His heroism was unquestionable, but the odds were insurmountable. At this point, with both engines failed and the aircraft in an uncontrolled descent, no pilot, regardless of experience, could have recovered it. The physics of the situation had taken over. The impact site was a scene of utter devastation. Wreckage was strewn across a wide area of hillside, a silent testament to the forces involved. The sheer energy of the crash meant there was no large fire, only pulverized metal and debris scattered among the olive trees and dry earth. Within minutes, local villagers who had witnessed the final descent began to arrive. Their initial hope of finding survivors quickly turned to despair as they surveyed the scene. Emergency services, already alerted by the Hellenic Air Force F-16 pilots who had watched the tragedy unfold, converged on the site. Their mission immediately shifted from rescue to recovery. Teams from all over Greece arrived, beginning the grim task of identifying the victims and gathering evidence. Families waiting anxiously in Athens, and those who had waved goodbye in Larnaca, were plunged into unimaginable grief as the news spread. The official investigation, led by the Greek Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board, the AAIASB, began immediately. Their task was to understand how a modern airliner could simply fall out of the sky without warning, to find the truth for the 121 people on board. First, the investigation, led by the Greek Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board, the AAIASB, unequivocally identified the critical origin of this disaster: the improper configuration of the cabin pressurization mode selector. You have to understand, this is a fundamental control, not merely a switch. After a routine maintenance check performed on the night of Saturday, August 13, 2005, the selector was left in the manual open position. This isn't just a detail. It's the difference between a cabin that maintains a safe, breathable environment at 34,000 feet and one that simply mirrors the outside atmosphere. Look, in manual open, the system's outflow valve remains fully open, continuously venting the cabin air. This means that as the aircraft gains altitude, the air pressure inside the fuselage steadily drops, matching the thinning air outside. A basic procedural step, returning that switch to auto, was missed. This failure to reset the system ensured the cabin pressure would never build, no matter how high the aircraft climbed. It transformed a perfectly capable Boeing 737-31S into an unpressurized shell, silently setting the stage for an insidious threat to everyone on board. This was a human error, a single overlooked switch, but one with profound and absolute consequences. Second, the subsequent breakdown in the flight crew's ability to accurately diagnose and respond critically underscores a significant design flaw in the Boeing 737-300 series. Here's the thing. The aircraft used a single, identical oral warning for two distinct and urgent situations: a takeoff configuration alert and a cabin altitude warning. When Captain Martos and First Officer Charalambous heard this alert during their takeoff roll from Larnaca, they associated it with a pre-existing minor electrical issue they had been addressing. This initial misidentification was a critical loss of time and focus. Once airborne, a master caution for equipment cooling further diverted their attention. The pilots, operating under immense pressure and without immediate clarity, were drawn into troubleshooting what seemed like an electrical anomaly using their quick reference handbook. You have to understand, the QRH, comprehensive as it was, did not adequately cross-reference the equipment cooling warning with the potential for a pressurization issue, especially given the shared warning alert. This meant the critical information needed to identify the true emergency was not readily available or linked in a clear, unambiguous way. By the time the cabin altitude warning light finally illuminated, indicating the true emergency, the crew would have already been experiencing the insidious onset of hypoxia. This oxygen deprivation began to silently impair their judgment, memory, and ability to perform complex tasks, even before they fully understood the nature of the crisis. Their communication with Larnaca Air Traffic Control, where the first officer reported the cabin air conditioning switch was in manual, was a critical miscommunication, hampered by his hypoxic state. He meant the pressurization mode selector, but the words used and heard caused a fatal disconnect. This cascade of a misleading warning system, combined with the physiological effects of hypoxia, left them fighting an enemy they couldn't clearly perceive or articulate. Third, and a critical underlying factor, was the operational environment and safety culture within Helios Airways itself. The Greek Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board's final report, number 11/2006, did not just point to individual errors, it highlighted a pattern of systemic issues. This Boeing 737-31S, registration 5B-DBY, had a history of maintenance irregularities, and the airline itself had faced previous scrutiny regarding its operational procedures and safety standards. You see, the initial maintenance oversight, leaving the pressurization selector in the wrong position, was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom. It was a symptom of inadequate procedures for verifying critical pre-flight configurations and a less than robust safety culture where such fundamental errors could occur and, crucially, go unchecked. In aviation, layers of checks and balances are designed to catch these exact kinds of mistakes, acting as crucial safeguards. For Helios Airways, these layers were clearly compromised, allowing a singular error to bypass multiple detection points. The fact that the flight crew missed the incorrect pressurization setting during their own pre-flight checks, and that a maintenance crew failed to return a critical switch to its safe position, speaks volumes about a broader organizational issue. This wasn't merely a series of individual missteps, it was a failure of the safety net meant to prevent them from escalating. And that's where it all went wrong, allowing a single, preventable error to escalate into a full-blown tragedy, culminating in the loss of 121 lives on Sunday, August 14, 2005. The official investigation, led by the Greek Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board, or AAIASB, issued its final report, number 11/2006. Their findings were stark and unambiguous, confirming the primary cause as the flight crew's incapacitation due to hypoxia, resulting from the aircraft's cabin pressurization system selector being left in the manual open position. This initial oversight, a human error during maintenance that went unchecked during pre-flight, was undeniably the trigger. However, the report also highlighted critical contributing factors. The confusing design of the Boeing 737's warning system, specifically the identical oral alert for both takeoff configuration and cabin altitude issues, which led to misidentification by the crew, and inadequate procedures for verifying the pressurization panel settings during pre-flight checks. From this tragedy, the aviation industry implemented significant, lasting changes. Boeing issued service bulletins to all 737 operators worldwide, specifically Service Bulletin 737-2, A1231, in September 2005, emphasizing the importance of correctly setting the cabin pressurization panel for flight. Airlines universally revised their pre-flight checklists to include explicit verification of the pressurization mode selector, ensuring it was in the auto position. Furthermore, pilot training on the recognition and response to cabin depressurization, particularly the insidious nature of hypoxia, was significantly enhanced, often including simulator scenarios that replicated the exact conditions of Flight 522. These concrete procedural updates and design clarifications, driven directly by the lessons of Grammatikos, have undoubtedly prevented similar accidents. We cannot put an exact number on it, but it's safe to say these changes have protected hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives by tightening the safety net around a fundamental system. The 121 souls lost on that Sunday, August 14, 2005, did not die in vain. Their sacrifice led to critical safety improvements that continue to safeguard air travel today. Look, this case presents a deeply complex scenario where human error, system design, and physiological challenges converged. Given the identical warning alert for both takeoff configuration and cabin altitude on the Boeing 737-300 series, and the crew's initial troubleshooting of what they believed was an electrical issue, what single procedural modification or technological enhancement, beyond what was implemented, do you think would have been most effective in preventing the initial misidentification of the true emergency? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis insightful, please consider giving this video a like. It's a small, free action, but it genuinely helps this independent channel reach more people who are passionate about understanding aviation safety. And if you want to join a community dedicated to these deep dives into the technical why behind aviation events, consider subscribing. Your support makes it possible for me to continue bringing these stories to you, told from the perspective of someone who has spent years in the cockpit. So, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know your take on Flight 522. Your engagement truly matters.